So I think this morning I'm really pleased to, first of all, introduce Tim Gill. To be honest, I think he probably doesn't need any introduction. I mean, he is a scholar, advocate, and consultant on childhood, and has done amazing work in changing governments and policymakers' views on how we address children or take them into consideration. I mean, unfortunately, Tim has to leave a bit early, so I think it's without further delay. I just send over to Tim, and then we go through the remaining kind of agenda for this morning. So, Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Katja. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my slides and the last little bit. Yes, good morning, and well done everybody for this early start. It's probably the earliest video conference webinar I've taken part in. Don't know about anybody else, but what you're looking at is an Aldo van Eyck playground. So this is one of the amazing program of creating playful spaces across the city of Amsterdam that Van Eyck was involved with for over 20 years in the aftermath of the Second World War. And most of what I'm going to be saying has parallels with what he was doing back then. I haven't got enough time to go into it in detail, but it's well worth checking out the story behind Van Eyck's playgrounds and the work of the municipality and the team in Amsterdam. There's some wonderful material online about that. Now, so we're talking about towns and cities for children, and so that raises some interesting questions about childhood and how childhood has been changing. And I think that when we think about childhood and children's lives and their lived experience in the cities and towns, one good place to start is with our own childhoods. And so I'm going to invite you to think about your own childhoods and the kind of experiences you had in your relationship with the neighborhood around you. And as you think about that and recall your own experiences of perhaps playing, exploring, and getting around the neighborhood where you grew up, I'm going to share this slide with you, which I use in many presentations. So what you're looking at here is a map, and it's a map that shows what you might call the roaming range or the home territory of 4 8-year-old children. But they happen to be 4 8-year-old children, but they all grew up in the same family. So they're 4 generations of the same family who all lived in the same city. So just to unpack that a little, this large blob that you can see that takes up most of the map, that's the home territory of the roaming range of the great-grandfather in this family at the age of 8. And he could go 10 kilometers, 6 miles across the city on his own. And then you can see the circles start to shrink. That's the grandfather at the age of 8. That's his roaming range. The mother at the age of 8 up here. And this little dot that you can see in the top left, that's the roaming range, the home territory of the son in this family, who's actually, he's allowed to go to the end of his street, but we know that's more freedom of movement. That's more of a kind of right to roam than most 8-year-old children. So what you're seeing here is what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. And I think it's one of the most profound and one of the most underexplored changes in the nature of childhood, and that changes in the built environment are crucial to understanding and are a big driver, not the only driver, but a big driver behind these changes. And I guess my reason for dwelling on this is because I hope you will feel a sense of loss, that children's lives today children have lost the opportunities to explore, to get to grips with their neighborhood, to roam, and that loss has consequences. But it's also a kind of signal of a wider problem with the built environment. So when we turn now to thinking about our sort of typical urban design and planning responses to children's demand for freedom, children's wish to play, children's right to play, well, then we often find ourselves confronted with public spaces like this one. Now, this is obviously a rather extreme example, but I think it speaks to the mismatch between children's appetite for experience, and the conventional and typical planning and design response to it. I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that firstly, playgrounds arose, they grew in cities in the last 120 years as a response mainly to the threat from traffic. 150 years ago, there was no such thing as a playground. Children effectively, when they had the chance to play, made use of the whole of the streets, the parks, the places around them. And so the playground was created in response to the growth of traffic in urban areas, the danger to children, and some kind of recognition of their need for space to play. But it's also worth recognizing that there are different responses that we can make to that threat from traffic, and indeed a story to be told about the threat from traffic. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the work and the story behind the remarkable sort of Dutch approach to public space, and in particular its origins in the campaigns from the early 1970s, particularly in Amsterdam, where literally hundreds of children every year were being killed in the streets of that city. And that the response of the people of Amsterdam, and over time of the Dutch authorities, was not to corral children into ghettos or reservations, but to take steps to make streets safer, to improve walking and cycling, and to allow to reduce the dominance and the threat from the car. And that obviously is a fairly familiar sort of path that's we're beginning to see in other parts of the world as well. But it's also worth reminding ourselves that even today, while the threat from traffic may not be so immediate to children, we're certainly not seeing the same levels of traffic fatalities that we did here in the UK and in many other parts of the world. We're still seeing what I hope you'd agree are scandalous consequences for children's health. And again, some of you may be familiar with this tragic case of Ellie Kissy Deborah, who at the age of 9 died as a result of the latest in a series of terrible asthma attacks, and that a legal process is now unfolding that could see her being named as the first person in the UK for whom air pollution, so simply the fact of polluted air, was her cause of death. And I think it should give us a serious pause for thought that now in the 21st century, we are creating environments where we are literally killing children through the air that they breathe as a result of poor planning and design. Now, I'm talking about child-friendly urban planning, and I think it's worth beginning to think about what that might mean in terms of a definition. The planner Brent Toderian used to be chief planner of Vancouver, a well-known urbanist. He writes a lot about family-friendly planning and design. And broadly speaking, I think for these purposes, we can say that places that are family-friendly are children-friendly. Actually, there are some differences there. But to a first approximation, he says, if you ask yourself what ingredients make up a family-friendly neighborhood, then firstly, a neighborhood that works for families has to have housing that works for families. That's an obvious, it's a non-starter if neighborhoods don't have dwellings that are big enough and suitable for families to live in. You also need good services. Any neighborhood that doesn't have good schools, childcare, health facilities is also going to be a place that families will not move to and will not stay in. But you also need that third leg that you can see here, and that's the public realm. Now, it may be that families might move to a part of the city or a neighborhood that has poor parks or dangerous streets, but it's extremely unlikely that they will stay there. And if they have any choice, they will likely move on. And it's this third leg of what makes neighborhoods work for children and families. It's the public realm that I'll be focusing on this morning. So my working definition of a child-friendly place draws on this framework. And essentially what this is showing is that for a place to be child-friendly, it needs to be doing well on two dimensions. The first dimension you can see along this axis here is the things to do dimension. Yes, playgrounds, parks, places to meet, socialize, leisure, essentially a good offer in a neighborhood. But that's not enough on its own. You also need good mobility. Crucially, children are able to get around that neighborhood on their own, walking and cycling. They're not dependent upon their parents or other adults to get them around. So it's only where you have both high levels of mobility up here and also a lot of choice of things to do that you are in this quadrant of a child-friendly city. So this is a definition that's founded in children's lived experience and the offers that cities make to children. And it draws on the work of Marketa Kitter, who's now the head of spatial planning at Aalto University in Finland. And almost everything I say from now on, really, you can go back to this diagram. So it's worth reminding ourselves that that understanding, that framework of child friendliness is effectively a way of mapping what children themselves say about what they like and what they don't like about cities. When we take the time to ask children about the things, about their views of the built environment, almost without exception, they will say the kind of things that you see here in this slide. They like to get around, have free movement, places to meet friends, a choice of things to do, and green spaces. And they don't like traffic and poorly maintained places. So I guess one of the reasons why I think that lived experience, that child-friendly framework is so powerful, is because it takes and distills what children have repeatedly told us many times about cities. And one of my messages, I guess, is that in this respect, we don't have to keep asking children for these things. What we need to do is to start acting on what they're telling us. So my next slide really is my attempt to sort of encapsulate some of the key built environment features of a child-friendly neighborhood. Now, I'm not going to run through these. The short version of this is that a child-friendly neighborhood looks like Vauban. Vauban, the eco-suburb in Freiburg in Germany that I dare say many of you in this audience will be familiar with. It's compact, it's easy to get around on foot or by bike, there's a lot of green space. Crucially, the role of the car is very, very modest. In Vauban itself, any car owners have to park their cars in one of several large parking lots on the edge of the development. And so again, one of the messages I think for urban designers here is, if we ask ourselves, what does a child-friendly neighborhood look like? It looks like a sustainable neighborhood. It looks like a livable neighborhood. Really, to all intents and purposes, they're very similar. Now I'm going to move on to talk a bit about one case study of a city that took seriously this vision and this goal of becoming more child-friendly and crucially of making its streets, parks and public spaces more child-friendly. And that's the city of Rotterdam. And the story behind Rotterdam is an interesting one. And it starts with a survey back in 2006 that showed, it was a survey of Dutch cities, and it showed that Rotterdam was the worst city in the Netherlands to bring up a child. That is not a league table that you want to be at the bottom of, especially in the Netherlands, which is indeed culturally very well disposed towards children. So the leaders of Rotterdam realized they had a problem, that families were fleeing the city or not wanting to move. And they decided to throw some serious money, tens of millions of euros, in a program to become more child-friendly. And I'm going to give you a flavor of what they did. And one of the best case studies is this neighborhood, which is just outside the city centre in a part of Rotterdam called Oude-Noord, where, with a really interesting partnership involving social housing body, the local level municipality, the state, the city municipality, several schools and designers effectively developed a play layer, a kind of child-friendly layer in this existing community, improving schoolyards, opening them up for public use, improving playgrounds, community gardens, greening streets, traffic calming, looking at opening up sports, the spaces in sports facilities, and a really comprehensive makeover of this neighbourhood. And it's one of a number of dozens, maybe hundreds of interventions that have happened in this Dutch city. Here's an example of a schoolyard that was given a fairly radical natural makeover, and this is open for public use outside of school hours. A couple of examples here. On the left, you can see a car park in that neighbourhood that I just showed you that was converted into a kind of quite flexible and interesting playful public space. On the right, one of the city centre prominent public squares where for a whole year a kind of pop-up playful intervention was put in. As well as the interventions on the ground, the city also developed, improved its policy making and had a really quite sophisticated approach to planning using GIS to identify, to map out busy streets, play spaces, streets that had the potential for wider sidewalks, and then to use that as a basis for planning improvements across a neighbourhood. And that's a reminder that we should realise that children don't actually grow up in cities. Children grow up in neighbourhoods. And so the planning and the design and the interventions that we make really need to focus at that neighbourhood level. And the end result of this, which the politicians were very happy about, was that actually families did measurably move into these neighbourhoods in greater numbers. So what we can wrap all this up in a relatively well-known phrase from the former mayor of Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa, and Katja hinted at it in her introduction, which is that if we can get cities or neighbours to work well for children, we can be pretty confident that they work for everybody. To put it another way, the presence of children of different ages, with and without their carers or parents, their presence as active and visible people taking their place in the public space of the city, that is the sign of the health of a city, in the same way that the presence of a salmon swimming up a river is a sign of the health of that habitat. Now, I've looked at a number of cities, not just Rotterdam, over the past 3 or 4 years, and you can see a map of some of them here. And these are all cities that have taken seriously the goal of becoming more child-friendly, that have gone beyond one-off interventions, consultation and get exercises, and have really started to make a difference on the ground. So I'm briefly going to share with you my findings from looking at these dozen or so cities. First, the building blocks. What are the bits of the built environment that these initiatives focus on? Streets, walking, cycling networks, public space, yes, including playgrounds, but many other types of space, and housing. Those are really the 4 domains, if you like, that need to be looked at. And then I've offered, on the basis of the experience of the cities that I looked at, a set of 9 principles. Now, that's not the easiest of slides. I'm not going to read through them all, but I'm going to pull out one principle that I think is particularly relevant right now, which I saw across the cities that I looked at, and that's being opportunistic. And we know we're living in extraordinary times right now, and many things we could talk about, the way public space is being used, the way children are using public space, but I want to focus on the trip to school. We know that there are going to be big problems in many cities with traffic growth as we go forward in the coming months because of the restrictions on public transport. So there's a real imperative now to get more children out of cars, to get more children walking and cycling to school. It's a tremendous opportunity. Just a few final slides on some interesting things that I think we're seeing in other parts of the world. I'm sure many of you are tracking with interest the work of the newly elected mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. And the slide you can see now is one of the visuals that she and her team are using to illustrate what she's calling the 15-minute neighborhood. The idea of that across Paris, our strategic goal, their goal in Paris now, is to make neighborhoods more resilient, more self-contained, to enhance opportunities for walking, cycling, living, playing within the neighbourhood where people spend their everyday lives. And again, it goes back to this point about a sustainable neighbourhood looking like a livable and child-friendly neighbourhood. So as we think about not only our response to the pandemic, but also our response to climate change, I'm offering you, I guess, the insight that if we listen to young people speaking about climate change, they're not saying, listen to us. They're saying, listen to the scientists. They're saying, adults, step up to the plate here and take a serious responsibility for the changes that we need to make. And interestingly, that same cry for a more serious and urgent response is being echoed even in the business world. This is a quote from one of the world's leading, I suppose, scholars of capitalism and of business studies, Professor Rebecca Henderson at Harvard Business School, and what she's making the point here, which I think is very relevant to planners and designers, is that we need to figure out how we can get from a very narrow, short-termist approach to planning that's dominated by vested interest, and instead to an approach to planning that is value-based, that is strongly driven by the longer term and by collective interest. And my closing pitch to you about taking a child-friendly approach is that it precisely allows for this to happen, that by thinking about children and bringing children's voices and views into the debate about urban planning and design, we inevitably make the process more focused on the long term, more focused on the collective good. So I will close with a brief plug for my book, Urban Playground, which is coming out in about 6 months, and a reminder that almost everything that I think those of you who work in practical terms on the built environment, almost everything you need to do to make them work better for children and for everybody else is to follow the child-friendly framework that you can see there on the right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was an incredibly kind of helpful and useful and kind of expansive introduction into this kind of mini-series. And I know you have to go in a few minutes, but just for the audience, Tim will be back. He will be watching and participating in the session this evening, and also kind of provide further insight from his work tomorrow. So there is a chance to ask him questions directly at that point. I think we will hear more about the 3 legs of the stool that you mentioned later this afternoon, when we hear about housing and streets for children in a little bit more detail from practitioners. So hopefully we will kind of, scratch the surface on all those different aspects. I don't think in 3 hours we have enough time to go into the detail, but hopefully it will be helpful. So Tim, I wish you a good day and see you this evening, and thank you for participating in opening the mini-series today.
Thank you. I look forward to rejoining.